One of the lessons of the last 20 years is when you just look at how political power is structured in the United States of America, retreating into the cities is not a great model for national political success, right? So let me give you one of my favorite stats. When Bill Clinton won the American presidency in 1996, there are a little over 3,000 counties in the United States. He won about half of the counties in the country. Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election, though she won the popular vote. She won something like 400 out of the more than 3,000 counties. We have seen over the last 20 to 30 years, the Democratic vote very much retract into these great kind of urban, suburban metropoles.
Have you heard of Dan Savage? My guess is if you're a warm-blooded American adult trying to make sense of relationships and sex, you've come across his column and podcast. But before Dan Savage was a sex advice icon, he was the editor of The Stranger, Seattle's free and famously freewheeling alt weekly, and he shared his perspective on politics. In response to 2 consecutive victories by George W. Bush over Al Gore in 2000 and then John Kerry in 2004, Savage and his colleagues offered a geographic explanation that was different from what anyone could see on the state-by-state electoral map. He described the U.S. as an urban archipelago, a network of densely populated, well-educated, affluent, and liberal-leaning cities and towns, bright blue dots on a largely red map. In 2004, and again in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected the first time, Savage and The Stranger made the case for drawing people into the enlightened blue bubbles of the urban archipelago. And that happened, but not exactly the way we would have thought or expected. Welcome to Pacific Time, the podcast where we ask the big what-if questions about the future of the West Coast, its challenges, its opportunities, and the potential for independence. I'm your host, Greg Ammerfell. Our guest today is Sandeep Kaushik. Sandeep wrote about politics with Dan Savage at The Stranger 20 years ago, and now he's a political consultant and commentator who hosts an excellent new podcast called Blue City Blues about what's going wrong and occasionally right inside America's liberal cities. Betting on cities, he says, hasn't worked out as expected for Democrats. And today, Sandeep's pulling back the curtain on the fights inside the left, the failures of progressive governance, and why the West Coast might need to stop waiting for federal permission and just get its act together. I started off the conversation by asking Sandeep to share the origin story of Blue City Blues. It's a killer story about the interplay between local and national political perspectives.
David Hyde, my podcasting partner, and I, we're now in our 4th year. We're 2/3 of a podcast called Seattle Nice, which is a kind of insidery look at Seattle municipal politics. And we do it with Erica Barnett, who is the publisher and editor of Publicola, an online news website here in Seattle. And so we'd been doing Seattle Nice together. And then David and I had been wanting to do more nationally focused stuff. Which really doesn't fit into the Seattle Nice format, which is very much focused on local municipal politics. As David and I were talking it through, we realized, there is another gap here in that nobody's treating the urban archipelago of blue cities as an entity unto itself, as something that's got its own distinctive set of commitments around politics and governance and culture and its own distinctive problem set and challenges. And what if we did that as a podcast? So we kind of noodled through that for a while and then ultimately ended up launching it right before the election last November with an episode with my former boss at The Stranger, Dan Savage, who had famously coined this phrase, the urban archipelago, after another searing election loss back 20 years ago, back in 2004, when we really, as last time the Republicans won the popular vote, and they won by running on culture war issues, running anti-gay marriage initiatives and stuff. So it was a very, intense election and searing defeat. And in the wake of that, Dan had sort of had the Stranger put out a manifesto about the urban archipelago and how we progressives, people on the left, should pull back into the cities as our bastions and sort of create our own culture and our own way of organizing ourselves and running the world. And David's and my premise was that is what happened over the last 20 years. We have kind of pulled back into this urban archipelago, and there's been some good things out of that and some not so good things out of it. Our first episode was with Dan talking about that. Then we had him come on right after the election to kind of dissect what had just happened, which was very, I think, Greg, you'd agree, kind of a terrible result. and Trump not only won the popular vote, but won every swing state. There was really, really clear movement among, I think, really important constituency groups that Democrats believe they're speaking to, movement of those groups towards Trump. So anyway, so that's been the idea. So that was the idea, right? We thought that there really wasn't anybody doing kind of a blue cities focused, collectively blue cities focused podcast. And so we've been doing it. It's been fun.
We started with the origin of Blue City Blues, but what Sandeep said next reframed the whole conversation. Not just about podcasting, but about politics. It's about what happens when cities become islands.
Yeah, the urban archipelago. So as Dan puts it, like when you look at the sort of maps of election results, the red-blue maps of where people voted Republican and where people voted Democrat, you see the West Coast is a solid mass of blue, and the Northeast is a solid mass of blue, and the interior of the country is a solid mass of red. And Dan's premise from the get-go is that is a very misleading way to look at the political divides in the country. And if you go to kind of get more granular level, what you see are these small circles of blue around America's biggest cities surrounded by a sea of red, right? That is the actual reality of the map. Like the densest parts of the country, the urban areas, the big cities and their inner ring suburbs are blue. And everywhere else, the sparsely populated, less populated, the exurbs, the rural areas are red. And so once you look at a map like that, that's where Dan got to. What we see is a kind of sea of red with these little blue islands sort of dotting the sea of red all across the country. And that's where he got the urban archipelago concept, right? That it's really the cities where left of center thinking and ideas and culture and beliefs happen. And we should lean into that and become kind of, in some sense, urban chauvinists, or, sounds pejorative, but which he doesn't mean in a pejorative way at all. Right. But yeah, that's the idea, right? That's the idea that we should see a commonality as urban big city residents across the country and see ourselves as part of a distinctive piece of American politics and the American civic fabric.
So Dan Savage, not only a national treasure as a sex columnist, but an incisive political commentator.
Dan is a very, very, Dan's a genius. And I wrote for The Stranger for 3 years and worked for him back when he was still very much editing the paper. So he's full of ideas. He's a very unconventional thinker about the world and a big thinker about the world.
How has the concept of the urban archipelago aged?
That is a good question, right? I do think one of the lessons of the last 20 years is when you just look at how political power is structured in the United States of America, retreating into the cities is not a great model for national political success, right? So let me give you one of my favorite stats. When Bill Clinton won the American presidency in 1996, there are a little over 3,000 counties in the United States. He won about half of the counties in the country. When Barack Obama won the American presidency in 2008, I think he won about 750, 800, roughly thereabouts, of the 3,000 plus counties in the United States. When Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election, though she won the popular vote, she won something like 400 out of the more than 3,000 counties. And I think when Joe Biden won the presidency in 2020, similar number, right? So we have seen Democrats over the last 20 to 30 years kind of move in, retract into these urban and suburban inner ring suburb metropoles. But the problem with that is that the way you apportion power in the United States of America is not based solely on population, right? The Senate is the classic example of this, right? Each state gets 2 senators, even if you only got a population of 500,000 people. Alaska gets the same 2 senators that California does, right? So when you look at the maps of congressional districts and, across the country and how they map out, you cannot win a majority just by holding the cities and their inner ring suburbs. You've got to broaden your geographical reach out if you want to build a majority, build a workable winning majority. And that's become an increasing problem for Democrats as we've retreated back into the cities, right? So when you look at wave elections where Democrats have won, the last one was 2018, where we won 40 or 41 congressional seats when Trump was last in power. AOC became the face of that election because she won this very, very blue district in inner Brooklyn, knocking off a more moderate Democratic incumbent. But she was really an outlier in that election. 35, at least, of those 40, 41 seats that he's picked up were in suburban districts where the candidates who won were running on much more kind of moderate Democratic messages and agendas, right? And that's just an inherent feature of the way our political system is set up that, if Democrats want to be majorities, they've got to be out there in places like, not just in Seattle, but out in, South King County or in Pierce County or Snohomish County and places like that. On the other hand, I think over the last 20 years, cities have become, huge fountainheads of ideas, and policies and innovation. And, we had on Blue City Blues, we had David Rolfe on, who's one of the, I think, premier architects. He was the SEIU international vice president, ran a very big local here in Seattle, SEIU local. But he was one of the main architects of the $15 minimum wage movement that swept across blue cities about 10 years ago. It really started, he ran a ballot measure in SeaTac for what was a very radical idea at the time to do a $15 minimum wage in the suburb of Seattle, and it won by 77 votes. He leveraged that to get the then newly elected mayor of Seattle, who I was advising, to push for a $15 minimum wage in Seattle. And from Seattle, it spread wildfire, LA, a whole bunch of cities, and then states like Florida started adopting $15 minimum wage measure. So that's just one example of the kind of policy innovation and ideas that did come out of the kind of urban renaissance, I think, that we saw for quite a while in big blue cities. So that's the plus side of it, right? The positive side. And I do think blue cities increasingly have kind of, for better and worse, shaped the identity and the idea set and the cultural commitments of the Democratic Party writ large.
So it sounds like the urban archipelago has proven to be an accurate prediction, but it's had both very negative and very positive outcomes. If you think Seattle and San Francisco vote the same, think again. As Sandeep explains, the West Coast isn't just blue, it's in open conflict with itself. What do you think the mainstream media narrative gets wrong about West Coast liberal cities?
That's a big question, and there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, there's a tendency to see them as all exactly the same, and they're not, right? There's a lot of difference between, even if you look at San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, right, who are, I think, similar cities in some ways, politically and culturally. They are what I would call white progressive cities. They're majority white, educated, affluent, knowledge economy, success story cities. And they do have a similar progressive culture to them. That said, there's a lot of variety and variation. San Francisco's politics, I'll just give you one example. San Francisco, the left in San Francisco is noticeably NIMBY in their politics, right? They are anti-development, anti-growth. The left in Seattle is 180 degrees opposite, right? They're very, very urbanist, pro-density, pro-growth, right? So that's just one example of the kind of sharp difference that you can see even in, cities that are the same shade of blue, right? So that's one piece of it. I don't know that nationally they get very well the nature of the political divides that we have in these blue cities. And I mentioned our battles are really between what I would call kind of movement left and center left, right? I'm a traditional liberal, or you could call, and maybe one way to talk about it is say it's a battle between liberals and progressives. And in some sense, it is a microcosm of the battles within the Democratic Party itself, right? If you think about the wings of the Democratic Party, whether it's the sort of AOC or Pramila Jayapal wings, or somebody like Adam Smith, a congressman here, it represents part of South Seattle and some suburbs. I don't know that important and complicated nature of that relationship between the movement and the left and the center left, I don't think gets characterized very well in how like West Coast blue cities get covered.
I've heard it said that a problem plaguing the West Coast at the state level and at the local level is that the Democratic Party has a monopoly on power. There's no competition. Do you buy that critique?
Yeah, it can be a problem. First of all, yes, it's true that the Democratic Party essentially has a monopoly on power, and that's really, I think, who's to blame for that? That's the Republicans' own fault that they're not competitive in these states. There was a time not that long ago when Republicans were competitive. There were times, I'm trying to remember the last time it wasn't that many years ago that they had control of the state Senate here in Washington State. But those days are over. And frankly, the Republican Party has become, by the standards of being a competitive party on the West Coast, it's frankly a clown car. They seem to have untethered themselves from any desire to actually win elections anymore, which on one level is very liberating. You can let it all hang out and say whatever, you believe and want and stuff. On the other hand, it makes you irrelevant and unelectable. That's what they've done to themselves, right? And so they have very much tied themselves to the mast of MAGA and Trumpism in ways that just do not resonate with majorities of voters in West Coast states or in blue cities more widely, and therefore they have been relegated to the sidelines. Now Democrats have significant, almost super majorities now in the legislature in most of these states, and really in Western Washington, Republicans are barely competitive anymore. So yes, so that makes the divide. The real debates happen within the Democratic Party now, as opposed to across the red-blue partisan divide.
And the factions you described, let's call them progressives and liberals, or left-leaning and center-left, are those formalizing? Are those crystallizing into sort of sub-parties that are going to help voters decide who to pick?
No, not yet. Or if it is, it's in a very nascent stage of kind of doing that. In a city like Seattle, there is a very well built up progressive infrastructure, right? Infrastructure on that the kind of left side of that divide, the progressive side of that progressive liberal divide. And there's a constellation of issue groups or ideological groups. You have the legislative district system for the Democratic Party at the grassroots level that is very much dominated by strong progressives, people to the left, probably of Bernie Sanders, right? Kind of run the grassroots level of the Democratic Party right now. You don't have that kind of infrastructure existing for the center left. They've not really made the investments. There hasn't been an effort to kind of build that up. So center left candidates win because they're good fits for their district where they're running, but they win kind of organically or oftentimes with the opposition of this constellation of groups that are often well funded. A lot of the money comes from progressive labor unions, but but also very progressive donors who fund this stuff. The one different example of this, we just did an episode of Blue City Blues about it because I find it so fascinating, is San Francisco, where there have been a handful of very, very wealthy tech moguls who have just in the last few years funded and seeded a very effective infrastructure that helped to push what has been a far-reaching moderate backlash in the city of San Francisco. And it's completely reshaped their politics. Moderates now control the Democratic Party structure down there. They control the board of supervisors, just elected a moderate mayor. They recalled 3 progressive school board members. They recalled the Soros-funded progressive DA. Like, there's been an enormous sea change in San Francisco politics. While some of that was organic and just happened as a backlash to the perceived excesses by many voters of what they saw as too ideological and not really practical or results focused progressive policies around things like crime and homelessness. On the other hand, the money that flowed from these tech folks into these big four organizations, there are four big which then have seeded a whole constellation of then smaller grassroots organizations, has been instrumental in helping to facilitate that change. So that's an example where you do have, you know, two very well developed infrastructures in San Francisco, one on the left progressive side and one on the moderate side. But that's an outlier, right? The great story of American politics in the last 30 years, and we can talk about how this fits into your sort of premise of West Coast separatism, but the great story of American politics the last 30, 35 years has been ever increasing polarization, right? That and ever more extreme polarization. And both parties have been moving apart from each other at a very rapid clip. It really starts, this story starts in the 90s and the rise of Newt Gingrich on the Republican side. And really the Republicans kind of they sort of broke the old collegial norms that existed inside the Beltway prior to that era and discovered that naked partisanship and, attacking and demonizing the other side could work very well politically. It coincided with the rise of things like Fox News, right? That, very partisan media. And the Democrats followed, right? The Republicans are more polarized than we are, but we're trying really hard to catch up to them. And you're right, Greg, the divide between the two parties is now the chasm, the line between them has grown into this ever growing chasm. And it's almost like we live in two different worlds. We see the world in two different ways. I can use some highfalutin language. There's almost a kind of, epistemic crisis in that we don't even recognize the same truth statements about, don't just agree on the same set of facts about the world, and our politics and how it works. So that is the story of American politics writ large, and the forces that exist, so far as I can discern. I'm not seeing anything that's going to push us back towards each other, right? If anything, the forces that are operating in American politics continue to push us farther and farther apart. I mean, Donald Trump is many things, but he is a polarization machine, right? He is nothing if not about sort of trying to inflame the passions of his own base, and by demonizing those on the other side. That's his whole modus operandi of how he kind of does politics and how he's been successful doing politics. So those dynamics are very, very front and center. And I saw some national polling recently that shows that Democratic voters are moving left. Just in the first 80 days of the Trump administration, there's been a noticeable shift left in the attitudes of Democratic voters as they're reacting to the provocations of the Trump administration. So that polarization stuff is still fully in play.
That brings us to effectiveness, because behind all the labels, progressive, liberal, leftist, there's a bigger question. Can we govern? Ezra Klein thinks we've lost our edge. So does Sandeep. There are plenty of people, including Ezra Klein in his new book, Abundance, arguing that, the path forward here might be to focus on effectiveness. And it goes back to things you've been saying about the urban archipelago. Cities have, the sort of earned national reputation of West Coast liberal cities is they haven't run that effectively in the last bunch of years. What is it going to take for the West Coast on an urban or rural level to be more effective and to counter the polarization that's preyed on us?
Yeah, I'm very much in agreement with the kind of Ezra Klein thesis there. That I don't think it's actually that new or innovative what he's saying in the book, but what's new and innovative is that it's him saying it. It's somebody with impeccable progressive credentials saying, "Hey, we've gotten off track, and maybe we've gotten too wedded to defending bureaucracies and not delivering results," right? I think that's a criticism of government and effectiveness that's been around for a while, but to hear it coming and sort of framed in a progressive way by somebody like Ezra Klein, I think that is what's new about it. Look, there's an economics blogger by the name of Noah Smith who I follow, and I like a lot of his stuff. He wrote a piece right after the November election that basically said, blue cities have got to get their acts together. I forget the title of his piece off the top of my head, but it's kind of a must-read piece where he makes the argument that blue cities from the 1980s on really went through a period of enormous energy and dynamism and creativity and innovation. And he sort of cites it as kind of circa 2012. He says that era sort of comes to an end. I actually think you can look at Seattle's history and there's a lot of very big, interesting, bold policy stuff happening into the kind of 2015, 2016 period, about 10 years ago. Till about 10 years ago, we were passing big things like a $15 minimum wage or big things like the HALA agenda about how we were going to add density to the city in significant ways, or all sorts of, worker protections and labor protections and renter protections and all sorts of different things that were happening, that were pretty big and bold and innovative, and that were then spreading around to other parts of the country. But that era seems to have ended, right? And now, for the last decade plus, blue cities have sort of seemed like they've not been able to muster the consensus or the thinking to address what seemed like or they're pushing bad ideas, sometimes counterproductive ideas that are actually magnifying what seemed to be an increasingly front and center set of problems that have been eroding quality of life and eroding affordability, right, in these cities. And this is less so happening in Seattle, but if you're looking at places like California, you're seeing people voting with their feet. They're leaving blue states and blue cities and moving to places where it's cheaper to live, which tend to be in red places. And if those demographic trends continue for very much longer, the electoral map is, which is already sort of problematic for Democrats because of the urban archipelago stuff we've been talking about, is going to become extremely daunting. So yeah, I do think there has been a period where blue cities and blue states have kind of gotten off track, and whether it's on issues like homelessness or public safety. What Noah Smith in his article said, he really points to two things. He says, one, housing prices have gotten out of control in blue cities, and that affordability problem is massive, and we just haven't been building the housing that we need to be building to kind of keep housing prices affordable and in alignment. I 100% agree with him on that. And the other place he points to is public safety stuff, where a set of abolitionist, defund, very, very, what were once kind of fringe left ideas became front and center starting about 10 years ago. And those ideas have not worked out very, very well in practice. It kind of sounds like Ronald Reagan saying, government's not the solution, it's the problem. I mean, to some extent in blue cities, that has become the case. We can have activist, dynamic government that where we differ from Ronald Reagan is Ronald Reagan was just blanket kind of anti-government. What Ezra Klein is saying is government has a very important central role. If you want to govern in a progressive way, then government has a very central role in being a dynamic agent of creating innovation and change and benefiting people and solving problems. We're just not doing it right now, and we've lost some of our foundational ideas, and we need to get those back on track. And I agree with that.
Well said. One thing I would throw into the mix, and then I want to shift to talking about what we can be doing on the West Coast, is, hey, we just moved past the 5-year anniversary of all of us working from home at the outset of COVID. And I think COVID knocked the West Coast on its ass, and the cities in particular. I think it really brought out some of our worst challenges that pre-existed the pandemic, but we're recovering from that. It also shined a very bright light. I mean, recall that the Black Lives Matter protests and it really came to a head during the COVID pandemic as well. So I think we're still kind of reckoning with all of the effects of that time. And yeah, the idea that now is the time we might bring attention back to running effectively, it seems so true. And then, we have this backdrop of what's happening at the national level where Donald Trump and Doge and the whole effort seems to be a fulfillment of the Ronald Reagan fantasy of small government, in very surprising ways. I think these are not very effective people who are acting very, very efficiently to put their ineffectuality in practice. And so as a result, we're seeing the feds withdraw from functions that we all just took for granted. We value our public lands. We value medical research. We value higher ed. We value, having a weather forecast from NOAA, and that's gone, or it's going away. And so now I think we're going to have to say, well, what part of government do we actually appreciate, and how can we take that and deploy it against some of our biggest challenges on the West Coast? And you've named them: housing affordability, homelessness, income inequality, et cetera, et cetera.
What we're seeing coming out of the Trump administration right now, this is not Al Gore reinventing government, right? Go back to the Clinton era when Al Gore was vice president and did, and some of these same sorts of ideas about how do we make government more effective, more responsive, more focused on addressing, the problems that people are facing in their day-to-day lives were front and center when Bill Clinton was president. And they did, Al Gore led an effort to rethink government and to figure out where they could prune away red tape and bureaucracies and stuff like that. That's not what's happening now, right? What they're doing is just taking a meat cleaver to huge swaths of the federal government and just destroying it in almost in an incredibly capricious and thoughtless sort of ways. And, it's one thing. I get it when, the Elon Musk of the world and Donald Trumps of the world say there's been a lot of this quote unquote woke shit that's happened. And, and the Biden administration embedded a lot of this stuff into the bureaucracies and into the functions of the federal government. And that's to some extent true, right? If you looked at USAID spending, right, the main trade organization that they've completely eviscerated, why were we funding some trans play in Colombia or these LGBTQ focused, whatever, in Central America? There's some of that stuff that probably your normie voter, if you told them we were spending money on, would say they're not, that seems like more a kind of cultural progressive political project than it does an actual reasonable use of taxpayer spending. There was some of that kind of stuff going on. If they had gone in and said, we're just going to rip all of that stuff out because we don't like it and we don't agree with, it's actually, this is all kind of left of center activism, not good governance, then I think a lot of people would have been pretty supportive of that. But that's not what they did, right? I mean, they went into USAID and they pulled all the funding that is providing, AIDS medications to people who have HIV in Africa who are now going to die, right? That's outrageous and wrong. And there's no, and these are small by any measure of the sort of scope and scale of American governance. These are small expenditures that deliver massive benefits and save millions of lives and improve the image of the United States in the world too, right? There is some actual tangible foreign policy benefit that comes from the United States engaging in these kinds of humanitarian efforts. And so to just callously get rid of all of that seems, outrageous and wrong and destructive and all of those things.
When Trump starts slashing federal programs, West Coast governors sue. But what if we stopped reacting and started acting like the nation state people say we already are? So we've done a lot of context setting for a conversation about the West Coast. Do you think the West Coast is diverging from the rest of the country politically, economically, culturally? Or is this idea of West Coast exceptionalism, our massive GDP, our role in the economy of, kind of creating entertainment and technology, is West Coast exceptionalism as full of hot air as American exceptionalism?
No, and maybe yes, right? So this is a complicated question because I think there are political cross currents that are in play related to how the West Coast engages sort of politically and culturally with the rest of the country. So one of them I talked about, sort of the biggest driver of American politics over the last 30 or 40 years has been polarization, right? And one of the downstream impacts of extreme polarization has been to nationalize our politics in a lot of ways. It used to be much more regional, right? So it used to be that you had the parties themselves were much more ideologically, diverse, right? Because they had different regional factions. Not so long ago, right? We had elected officials in Washington state, statewide, who were what we call the old Northwest Republicans. They were fiscally moderate to conservative, but they were, green, and they were, socially moderate to liberal, right? So there used to be much more regional difference and regional variation in our politics of the sort that would feed into the kind of West Coast separatism, Greg, that you've been talking about. A lot of that has been kind of wiped out over the last 25 years or so. So that's something that mitigates against your thesis. On the other hand, there's been interesting work done by some political thinkers and strategists recently. A guy by the name of Roy Teixeira and his partner in this is another guy by the name of Yuval Levine, who recently wrote a book and paper where they pointed out that the kind of yo-yo back and forth political divide that we've had in our national politics over the last 30 years, where Republicans are in the ascendancy now, but give it 2 years and the Democrats there'll be a backlash against Trump and we'll take Congress back. And, probably hopefully in 4 years, we get the presidency back and then they'll flip again, then everybody will have a backlash against the Democrats. And then, some Trumpist will get real, that pattern of evenly divided parties and power swinging back and forth between them is historically a very unusual circumstance. And typically in American history, in a two-party system, you have a dominant party and a minority party, and that there are periods of decades, 2-3 decades, where one party will be in the majority. So that, and they've been predicting this period of this unusual period of back and forth and even divide is going to come to an end, and one party is going to emerge dominant, and there's going to be a period of more political stability with a dominant party and a minority party. So if that's the case, and it's the Republican Party, if you look at this last election, if I had to bet right now, if that's going to happen, it may well be that nationally it will be the MAGA Republicans that emerge victorious out of this period of defeat. And if that is the case, then the case for West Coast separatism goes way, way up, right? I mean, if you go back to the first Trump term and the ideas he was and policies and politics he was playing back then, what you saw was a massive wave of anger and resistance all up and down the West Coast. You actually saw more efforts for regional cooperation between governors in Sacramento and Salem and Olympia, kind of working together, whether it's on climate or other sorts of issues, to kind of push back on what they saw as the really terrible decisions coming out of the other Washington, in the Trump ascendancy. So already I think you're seeing some of that coalescing starting to happen again. Like, Trump is so far in opposition to the basic sort of cultural and ideological and political and social commitments that we have here in blue states on the West Coast, that I think there's going to be a natural reaction to kind of try to bring them together in opposition to this, especially this time around where there's no guardrails. And we've been talking about some of the things they're doing. They're destroying the federal government, but they're also targeting blue cities and blue states and the kind of institutions that tend to dominate those places, whether it's philanthropy or universities or other sorts of institutions like that. They very much all have a bullseye on their backs right now. So it doesn't feel like our federal government is on our side on the West Coast right now. They seem very hostile, and they seem determined to try to not work with us, but to break us, right? So obviously, if that continues, if the Republicans gain some kind of longer-term ascendancy over the next, few years, which, as I was saying, some of this electoral college stuff that's happening of migration between states suggests that may be coming. The redistricting happens in 2030, and we could see a 19 electoral vote net shift towards the Republicans from blue to red if what's happening right now holds 5 years from now. So that's pretty ominous. So if that starts happening, I think West Coast separatism is going to get a huge jolt out of that, right? So that's what I mean about cross currents. On the one hand, we've kind of lost some of our regional, individuality as a region in this kind of more bipolar, nationally focused sort of political world that we live in. On the other hand, we're very much not aligned potentially with where our national politics are going. And that's going to spur lots and lots of energy and interest in finding some way to detach.
Well, to your point, just yesterday I saw Gavin Newsom, talking straight to camera, appealing to Canadian tourists to keep visiting California. So there are rumblings of kind of a distinct foreign policy, although kind of more in the vein of the California Tourism Board. You're hinting, Sandeep, at something that I think is real, and the question is whether it's coalescing into something big. West Coast frustration is not unique to one political party or the other with the federal government. Taxation without representation has been a real cry from both sides for some time. And just to put some numbers to that, I mean, my estimate is the West Coast spends something on the order of $500 billion a year in federal tax. We get back about 75% of that. But what's happening right now with the Trump administration suggests that we're going to be getting back even much less than that. So I think that, taxation without representation is a fun bumper sticker, although it did give rise to the Tea Party of the 90s. Could that coalesce into a real political call? Are there policy mismatches around climate, around healthcare? Is the fundamental disagreement over Democratic representation or not going to turn into something really meaningful that gets people on the West Coast to look at the idea of Cascadia or Cal exit in a very serious way?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. Any way you divvy it up, when you look at sort of blue states versus red states, or look at by the congressional districts, obviously the blue parts of the country are not, they're not just wealthier, though they are significantly wealthier than red districts and red parts of the country, but they're increasingly diverging in terms of their economies, right? I mean, Washington State is probably the most trade dependent state in the country. These West Coast cities, we are very Pacific Rim. We have really strong organic ties to across the Pacific, as well as with Canada for us, or, California with Mexico. There's not just a kind of potential for resentment to develop because we're a net donor state and we're going to get back even less of what we're sending to the federal government that comes back to help us here. That sort of resentment is potential, but even more so, just the difference between us and them, right? I remember back when I was writing for The Stranger back in 2004 or 5, and there was a Republican state senator from Eastern Washington who had dropped a bill that didn't go anywhere, but caused a lot of attention at the time, to split the state in two, right? He was like, you guys over on the western side of the state, very different from how we think over here. We haven't had a state Supreme Court justice from Eastern Washington since the 1920s or something. We haven't had a governor from Eastern Washington in a century. And he kind of made this case saying, we are disenfranchised. Let us go. We'd rather be our own state or part of Idaho. And I went out to Eastern Washington and I talked to people about it, and I wrote a piece for The Stranger kind of saying, what if we took this seriously and said, you guys are different from us. Maybe you guys go do take your own, you can name your state Reagan and we'll be Washington, and, we can go our separate ways. And I do think some of that divergence is quite real, that there are real cultural differences. There are real economic differences. Those things are growing between the very blue West Coast and lots of other parts of the country. There's, our intersection with these huge forces like globalism and nationalism and all of that stuff. We may be going in a fundamentally different direction than much of the rest of the country, and at some point something's got to give on that, right? You just you can't maintain a unified country if democracy and a republic only works. Partisanship is an important piece of what makes democracy and a Republican form of government work, but it's also, if partisanship gets out of hand, if polarization gets out of hand, you end up in a kind of Weimar situation where the very legitimacy of the republic starts to fall apart. And it's not crazy to think that that's where we're headed, right? It certainly seems like, we haven't talked about this stuff, but what the Trumpies are doing in terms of running roughshod over basic checks and balances of our democratic government and kind of trying to act as if they have near absolute power seems to be eroding things like constitutional protections and due process and, chilling speech. So are we headed in that direction? Quite possibly. And certainly the more they do that stuff, the more folks on the West Coast who think differently than they do are going to want to coalesce together in opposition to that.
Well, your example about Eastern Washington, I think, is really interesting because as I think, and sort of brainstorm about what the West Coast could be, I don't hope for a place that has a very narrow band of liberal opinion. I think we should be rooting for a place that celebrates a diversity of perspectives and really finds ways to serve lots of people with lots of different interests. If you're a farmer in Eastern Washington or Eastern Oregon or Central California, I would hope that liberals in the city would be interested in the product of your farms and want to make sure that the international market for your products is strong. That's good for everybody in the region. So, that it'll be interesting to see if in trying to protect democracy on the West Coast, we remember that we have to protect a diversity of perspectives and opinions.
I 1,000% agree with you on this. I'm very much, that's music to my ears. I actually don't think as we become increasingly monochromatic in our governance of blue cities, as we were talking about earlier, that's led to good results. I think we've become kind of too ideologically purist and not focused on the kind of testing our ideology against results and being more pragmatic to try to make determinations about what's working and what's not and changing direction. So I think that's where we've kind of gotten off track. Yeah, I just think we're better off if there is a real and healthy debate, diversity of viewpoints and and conversation across divides where we kind of work together to find common ground. That's very much. I'm a traditional liberal, right? A kind of Enlightenment lib. So I believe in all those things that some people now denounce as white supremacy. I think that's idiotic. But like things like tolerance, pluralism, secularism, the primacy of rationality, individuality, all of these sort of foundational principles that have traditionally dominated small L, liberalism in this country for the last at least half century that I've been alive, right? And that whole liberal idea is very much rooted in exactly the kind of dialogue and interplay and and pluralistic cooperation, Greg, that you're talking about. So I hope I hope we get back to that. I hope we move in that direction. I hope we get back to that. I'm kind of pessimistic right now that's where it's going. And I think maybe we're going much more to a kind of more separatist, kind of world where we just don't get along and can't work together and, start thinking about getting a divorce, right? As opposed to renewing our marriage vows.
So, Sandeep, are you seeing any appetite for greater autonomy or self-determination from regional leaders?
Not yet. But we're only 82 days or whatever it is into the Trump administration. I mean, I think there was a kind of stunned quiescence when the election first happened in November, right? People were just kind of shocked. People around here, I think, were kind of shocked by the scale of the defeat. And that period of silence and quiet is clearly ending. We saw just on April 5th, big protests around the country, 1,200 different protests, big protests in Seattle, even bigger ones in some other cities. I think the provocations of the Trump administration are so extreme that's just going to grow and continue. Like I said earlier, I've definitely seen some polling data that shows that Democratic voters are they're kind of retreating into a progressive bunker and becoming more intensely wanting more kind of fight from their leadership and more and doubling down on kind of progressive foundational beliefs and ideas and stuff like that. So to answer your question, I haven't seen a lot of talk like that yet, but give it a couple more months. We have seen some proto things like that. I think the whole things like the sanctuary city movement, right, which is very, very established in West Coast blue states and blue cities, is in some sense really got a huge boost during the first Trump term and is in some sense an attempt to say, we don't trust you, the federal government, to handle the way you're handling immigration and dealing with migration and immigrants and refugees does not align with our values, and we're going to take different approaches to that. So that's something that came out, over the last 8 or 10 years or so is very strongly entrenched, and not just in West Coast blue cities, but in place, in other blue cities. And so I think on issues like climate, there's already there's a executive order that Trump signed just in the last week that targets things like cap and trade systems, right? That we have here in Washington State, that California has, that we're talking about growing and building cross state, cap and trade markets. That's all very much under threat from the Trump administration, and the governors of Washington, Oregon, and California have very strongly come out to say, we're not having that. Like, you don't no right to take away our approach to climate and some of these big bold policies that we're pioneering. And so I do think you're going to see increasing efforts for these three Western states to kind of come together and cooperate and resist some of this Trump stuff. I do think you're right. Like, at the end of the day, the best way to resist Trump is to govern ourselves well and effectively and solve our problems. And we should be the magnet where people are coming to our states because they want to live here, not leaving because they think we don't have our shit together, or, we're too expensive or whatever. Right. Like, so at the end of the day, we need to get our own house in order.
It all leads back to this. If we want more autonomy, we have to earn it by solving real problems and showing what functional, inclusive government can look like. What would you love to see West Coast cities and states do that they're not doing today?
Well, I do think there's a lot of room for regional cooperation. That some of that did happen I was going back in preparation for this conversation and looking back at some of the headlines from 2017 about West Coast governors coming together and stuff like that. I think that some of that sort of withered or atrophied, but I do think they need to create structures, right? There's obviously the Democratic Governors Association, there are the Democratic AGs, but I think there's a commonality of interest and issue sets that are particular to the West Coast, where you could see more structured regional conversation and cooperation that comes out of that stuff. I do think that, depending on how far this Doge and MAGA stuff goes, there may be places where West Coast governments are going to need to step up on the state or regional or city level to try to pick up functions that previously the federal government was handling. I'm already hearing it from, I was just talking recently with the head of one of the largest opioid, medically assisted opioid treatment, the methadone clinics here. And they're already losing millions of dollars in federal money. I was talking all across the social service agencies, funding for housing, for homelessness interventions, for, drug treatment interventions. That money that was previously coming from the feds seems to now be disappearing. And it would be a terrible, terrible shame if we locally or at the state level did not step in to figure out how to make sure those really, really important efforts and programs continue to get funded and hopefully, grow and become more effective and get taken to scale to actually solve some of the problems we're seeing on the streets of our cities. So, yeah, I think it's going to be a very, very, very challenging time over the next few years. Buckle your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but hopefully we can see West Coast governments rise to that challenge.
At the center of Pacific Time is a what if question. What if the West Coast could start from scratch, Sandeep? What would we do?
Boy, if we could start from scratch, I think we would have a totally different tax code, in these West Coast states. I mean, you hear it from you hear it a lot. A lot of this comes from the progressive left when you talk about Washington State. Like, we have a totally different tax code than Oregon does. We have a really high sales tax. They have no sales tax. California has an income tax. Oregon has an income tax. We don't. There are these massive variations between states in our basic sort of, governmental policies and structures, and not just on things like taxation, but that's a very good example of it there, where I think we would rationalize a lot of that if we could start over. You hear from progressives, we don't have an income tax here, and we have, the 49th of the 50 states, the most regressive tax code in Washington state, right? They're right. Our tax code does suck. Like it's not really rational how we allocate the cost of funding our public sector, and so if we could say, but it's very, very difficult to change. We passed in Washington state, we passed a capital gains tax. That was a big shift that took us from 50th place to 49th place on the regressivity list. So there have been some changes, but the fundamental restructuring of our tax code seems like it's something that is beyond the ability of our politics to do. There are plenty of other areas like that. I think probably how you funded and handled homelessness policy, which tends to happen on this kind of micro local level in ways that isn't particularly conducive to taking efforts to scale. The state, Washington itself, has only very recently spent any money on homelessness, stuff at all. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would do all of that differently, right? There's a lot of different governmental processes that probably could use a whole different look if you could wipe out what exists now and build a more rational system on top of it and a more efficient system on top of it. So that's where I would start. I do think we've gotten off track culturally, to some extent. You were talking about this, Greg, like where you don't want to see us turn into this very monochromatic, almost sort of culturally oppressive kind of environment where you're not allowed to kind of deviate from certain orthodoxies. And I think that a lot of that has happened in recent years in West Coast cities. And if I could wipe that out, I would go back to the old sort of liberal order, liberal culture that, held us in, I think, in very good sway over the last half century, but, we've gotten away from in the last 10 or 15 years. If I could wave a magic wand, I would bring that stuff back, right? And ground our governance and our politics in those sort of basic liberal cultural values, right? Enlightenment values. That's where I would go.
That was Sandeep Kaushik explaining how blue cities have shaped America's culture, its economy, and its political movements. But, he suggests, can blue cities shape the country's future? The future of the West Coast? That's going to take something else. Less purity, more pragmatism. Less bubble, more blueprint. If we want more autonomy, we have to earn it by solving real problems and showing what functional, inclusive government can look like. There's lots more to discuss on Pacific Time. Listen, follow, and share reviews on Apple Podcasts, Pocket Cast, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Get in the conversation on Substack, Instagram, Facebook, or Blue Sky. Thanks as always for being with me in Pacific Time, and let's keep asking the big what-if questions about the future of the West Coast.